Welcome to the Hazmatters podcast, a discussion of all things hazardous for those who manufacture, distribute, transport, or handle hazardous materials in any way. Join the STARS Hazmat Consulting team, Wendy Buckley, founder and CEO, and Andrew Gullifson, VP of Customer Experience, as we welcome guests to discuss topics and investigate real-world examples that affect our industry every day. The Hazmatters podcast starts right now. Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Gullifson, VP of Customer Experience here at STARS Hazmat. And with me, as always, is our founder and president and CEO, Wendy Buckley. How are you, Wendy?
I'm great, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a lovely Wednesday here. And for those, maybe you're listening to it on a Wednesday. I don't know. Things like that. Well, so today, one of the things we wanted to kind of talk about is some of the differences between transporting hazardous materials via rail and by truck. There are some similarities, but there are quite a few differences on that. And, a lot of it really sort of depends on your business need, but sometimes it's kind of driven by either what you're familiar with. So kind of breaking down some of those ideas about like what you may not know to be able to kind of help you make better decisions going forward. So that's where we want to dive into. Anything you want to just sort of throw out to start things off here, Wendy?
Yeah, I have found over the 28 years of my career that kind of like what you said, people tend to avoid things they don't quite understand. And so in some cases, our clients have turned away business because they don't understand the nuances of rail or they don't understand how, going with a combination of rail and truck can really benefit their company. And, so if you have questions, if anyone has questions and they don't understand something or, that they're not sure what the risks are and so forth, come and talk to us. That's what we're here for. We're consultants because that's what we do. We consult, we provide advice, we educate, we provide guidance, and we'll help you make, like you said, Andrew, the best choices to optimize your transportation.
No doubt. And like I said, my background is much more truck centric. And yours, I mean, again, everything, but you started out kind of in the rail world. Rail side of things, rail world.
I don't know everything, but yeah, let's go with that.
We'll go from there on that. So really, I mean, I guess from, looking at it in a very general sense, the size of the rail containers versus the truck, you can get, would you say 3.5 to 4, kind of volumetrically, 4 times as much material in a rail car versus a truck. So just that from a cost perspective and even, the cost per ton mile is significantly less to move via rail. What are some of the other pros that you would say for moving rail versus truck?
Well, of course, with driver shortages and so forth right now, it's a lot harder to get trucks, especially for the longer hauls. I mean, let's be honest, truck drivers have a tough job as it is. And, they don't want to be gone on weekends and for days at a time if they can avoid it. They'd rather do those short hauls and be home at night with their families. So it's easier and cheaper to get trucks for shorter distances. So generally the rule of thumb is under 500 miles, it's typically better to use trucking, and over 500 miles, it typically is more cost effective to do rail. Like you said, it can take 3 to 4 trucks off the road and put that in a rail. And, you think about a rail car, a train can, with one engineer, one conductor, can haul as many as 200 cars. That's as much as potentially, 800 trucks. So that's a lot of traffic that's not on the highways with our 16-year-olds just getting their licenses, or, grandma who probably shouldn't have her license anymore, or the mom and dad who, just had a rough morning and aren't paying as much attention and so forth. So, and there is definitely a place for trucking. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm saying there is a place for truck and there is a place for rail.
Right. Absolutely. And again, I think using both, in some cases, again, if you don't have a railhead, on your property and things like that, chances are either, from hazardous materials, if it's a tank truck, you're going to need a transloader to be able to then ultimately move it into a truck. But kind of the flexibility on that, where it becomes, for the longer distance, the economical side of using rail, and then being able to bring it either to your facility or to your customer's facility, using truck to get there. You've got that. And so that, like I said, it's not like you're taking jobs away from drivers. There will always be a need for truck.
Yeah,
It's just, again, how it's best utilized, to go forward.
absolutely.
Yep. And then I was kind of, just doing a little bit of research in terms of just even the number of accidents that are out there with, for hazardous materials. And it looks like, truck incidents related to hazardous materials are about 2.5 to 3 times the number than they are for rail side of things.
It's actually probably even higher than that. But let's put it in perspective. There's a reason for that. Like I said, first of all of these trucks, first of all, there's a lot more truck than there is rail, right? Because again, you can put 800 trucks, the equivalent of 800 trucks worth of product on one train, right? And so that's the first thing, is that's 800 fewer trucks than there is trains. So there's 800 more opportunities for an accident than there is for that train. Let's also think about a train can't turn, right? A train doesn't have a traffic all around them, right? There might be, a train on the other track, or, coming at them, they got to pass each other. But honestly, they don't really come into contact with other trains that frequently. Certainly not the kind of volume that we would see on, I-95 on the East Coast, or Route 70 here in the Midwest, or, so on and so on and so on. And so there's a lot more trucks, a lot more opportunities for incidents, again, grandma, the 16-year-old, distracted mom and dad, etc. Lots and lots of things can happen. And truck drivers, honestly, they make mistakes too. They're professional drivers, but we're all human. So one of the things that's nice about the train, it stays on the rails. They don't have to turn, all they got to do is go forward, slow down, speed up, stop. Makes it a lot more simple. And because they have a dedicated pathway, there's a lot less opportunity for accidents. So just by the nature of the transportation itself, there's going to be more accidents by truck than rail.
Absolutely. And again, when you look at it too, just when there is an accident, with a truck, depending on if it's a tanker or, a dry van or a refrigerated truck, is, could it be that part of the material is damaged? Whereas, chances are, if there's a spill from a tank car on a train, on the rail, I mean, you're going to lose a lot of product, in regards to that. So, again, it pretty much has to. I mean, I guess the safety, and that kind of brings us, I guess, to the next question, really more about, the regulations, in terms of the strict aspect of those regulations. From your opinion, are they higher on rail than they are on truck? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there is differences in the regulations, but let's be clear and make sure we're talking apples to apples here, because when you go by truck, most people are very familiar with like LTL, FTL, where you're putting boxes and drums and maybe even totes, on a truck, on pallets and that sort of thing, and that's more non-bulk transportation. Totes can be bulk, but you're not filling up a giant tank truck, for example. We see the gasoline tankers and things like that, but most of the trucks that we see on the road are going to be containers, typically palletized goods of some sort or another. Typically, when you see rail cars, people see the box cars, but they don't really think about what's in there. So what they see mostly when it comes to hazmat specifically is going to be your tank cars and hopper cars. That's where most of your hazmat lives. But there is also, and not quite as visible to the public, lots and lots of intermodal containers. Sometimes the box cars will have hazmat, but generally it's going to be in those intermodal containers. And they don't always have to be placarded, because inside of there is going to be drums and boxes and totes and all those same non-bulk things that tend to be on the truck. So if you have an accident on rail and you lose a whole tank car load, let's say you're talking about the bigger tank cars, you're talking 30,000 gallons, the smaller ones, sometimes 20,000, maybe even a little bit less in some cases. When you're talking about a tank truck, you could be 6 to 10,000 gallons generally. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that, but generally that's what you're looking at. But when you're talking about, even the largest totes, it's only 4,000 liters. When you're talking about boxes and whatnot, you're talking, at most 50 pounds, maybe 100 pounds if you have a really big box, but most of those are going to be a lot smaller, a few pounds, a few ounces, things like that. So when you have an accident with an LTL truck, you're looking at a very different problem than when you have an accident with a tank car. So the regulations for the bigger quantities, whether it's by tank or by truck or by rail, are going to be a lot more strict. You get a lot less relief. You have to follow all the rules. When you deal with the smaller stuff, you get a lot more built-in regulatory relief, like you were mentioning once before, limited quantities. I think we talked about in the last episode. That gives you a lot of built-in relief in the regulations, so you don't have to follow everything. You get to skip some things.
Understood. And just as a reminder, and again, most people know, just because it is a limited quantity does not mean it's less dangerous.
Yeah.
It means you get regulatory relief because of the quantities that it's shipped in.
Yes. Still a hazardous material, in case you're wondering.
Yes. And that's, sort of a big point. And I think, a lot of people still kind of view, if they see that sort of, the black diamond with the black triangles and the white stripe in the middle of it, think, oh, it's not hazardous. No, it's still very hazardous. It's just, again, there's relief, regulatory relief that you get based on the quantities and the size of how it's packaged.
Exactly right.
No doubt. And, sort of looking at it. So, when people are kind of, I guess, shippers, and I am not really people necessarily, but, as shippers are looking at kind of the best way to approach that, let's say, again, they don't have a railhead that's going to come up to there, or they don't have a shed that they can pull a rail car directly to their facility. Talking a little bit about, transloading as an option for, moving, that large bulk product across the United States or even into Canada. Some approaches to that.
Transloading has really seen, at least from my perspective, has really seemed to explode in the past couple of years. We have a lot more clients.
We don't want to talk about exploding and translating, do we?
No, well, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe that's a poor choice of words, right? But it seems to have gotten a lot more popular in the last couple of years. We have a lot more clients who are getting into transloading for the very first time. And so, they're seeing the benefits of it. Like you said, transportation chain flexibility is a huge one. So, when you're taking approaches like this, obviously, when you're choosing a transloading company, you want to make sure that they have a good track record, right? You want to make sure that you're choosing a company who doesn't have a history of spilling the stuff all over the place and whatnot. So when you are doing the research, there's actually a very little known database, the PHMSA Internet database, where you can actually track performance records for shippers, for carriers, and so forth. And the transloaders would be considered to be probably a shipper at that point. Depending on the structure of it, they may also be the carrier. And so they should be showing up on that database as, if an incident happens that they're dealing with, it should show up on that database. So the only trick to that is that you have to get a PHMSA login, which is free. It doesn't cost anything, but it used to be publicly available. Anyone could just go on there and look at it, but now it is behind that login wall, but it doesn't cost anything. So create a free login, and then you can get in and still get the same access you had before.
Got it. So, I mean, as you're looking at that, I mean, do you mind? And I know we don't have any necessarily visuals about this, but what are some of the things you're looking for in there? Is there, in terms of how it's structured, to be able to say, okay, I mean, is it similar to the FMCSA, site in terms of how they rate things? A little bit different, or is this okay?
Yeah, no, it's definitely nothing like the safer database that you're talking about or the CSA scores. It's basically just a list of incidents that have happened, and you can give it a date range, the last 5 years or whatever. And you can go in and see if they've had any incidents with their name listed as the shipper or the carrier. Um, and I mean, basically, it's supposed to be the information is supposed to be required in certain areas and formatted in certain ways. And then there's this narrative section. But if you spend any time looking at that database, you'll discover that the data is not as reliable and organized as it ought to be.
Okay.
But read the narrative sections. That will give you a much better idea of actually what happened. And a lot of times you may see something like a hose blew out, which is not technically a transportation accident, but it gets recorded a lot of times because it's a pre-transportation function. And that stinks, but it's not always an indication of something gone wrong. But leaving a valve open, that's a problem. That's a safety problem. That's something that should never happen.
Gotcha. So just from a use case standpoint, so when folks get onto the FMCSA Safer site, they can see that they may have an inspection or some kind of violation for hazardous materials, but you know nothing about it. I mean, that's one of the items that's hidden. So can you actually go to the PHMSA site to maybe be able to, hey, I'm looking at this particular carrier, this MC number, and then go to the PHMSA site to potentially kind of align the two of those and see what's going on?
Well, if the inspection is an inspection, then no, because that is just an incident database, which means leaks in transportation. It could be vapor leaks, it could be liquid, it could be, powder, whatever. But if the inspection was just a roadside, wayside inspection, it's not gonna show up in there. But if they got into an accident and had a spill, then it will show up in there.
Okay. And that's good because I think that, that's one of the things that a lot of folks, whether it be shippers, brokers, and such, will go to the safer side to be able to see items. But there are, particularly on the hazardous materials side, there's very limited information that you can get a hold of, and so particularly if you are shipping hazardous materials or looking for that hazardous materials carrier. Utilizing both of these, I think, can be really beneficial to, making the right choice and the audit process and the validation of carrier choice.
Yeah, and you also go into the PHMSA registration because a carrier, a trucking company that has to, or even a rail company that's going to haul hazardous materials does have to register as such with the PHMSA site. So you can go in there and make sure they have a current registration, that it hasn't expired, that they've kept up with it. You can see that at least.
Got it. You and I were talking the other day, and one item that was brought up is that usually when someone's making a choice for transportation, they're like, oh, let me get 3 bids or multiple bids on this to make sure that we're maintaining a proper price point. And again, from a truck road carrier standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. But from the rail side, if you want to kind of jump on and the experience that you had.
Yeah, there was a woman I was speaking with just a few months ago who was, we were talking about how a lot of people don't really understand how different rail and truck actually are, particularly with logistics. And so this young woman was telling me that her executive had demanded that they get 3 bids before selecting the rail carrier. And that's great in trucking. He came from a truck background, and that makes a lot of sense. You have a lot of options when it comes to trucking. It doesn't work like that when it comes to rail. You're typically captive to one railroad. Sometimes you may have a choice between two, but generally you don't get a choice. I mean, if you want to go by rail, this is your option. That's the only choice you have. And if they're horrible, that's your problem. If they're great, then great for you. There's really no competition when it comes to that sort of thing, and that's true countrywide. That doesn't change. So the woman was trying to explain to the executive that that's not how it works. We can't get 3 bids from different companies. It's not an option, and it took a while before he could understand that.
Got it. As well. Another thing that you had brought up too is that the railroads, while they may own cars for flatbed cars and box cars, things like that. When it comes to tankers and things like that, it's really through either the shipper owning the car or leasing companies. And so again, there's another party that's potentially involved in the utilization of tank cars or some of the the larger bulk product going on rail.
Yeah, and that's a big difference between truck and rail. Generally, when you're going to hire a tank truck driver, the company that you're hiring typically owns the tractor and the trailer. That isn't owned by the shipper in most cases. Now, there's exceptions, of course, but most of the time, it's the carrier that's going to bring the trailer and the tractor, and the shipper really gets no say in which one is chosen. But when it comes to rail, it's just the opposite. The railroads do not own tank cars. As you mentioned, they may own flat cars and box cars and things like that, and sometimes hopper cars. Most of the time, covered hoppers in particular are owned by either, like you said, the leasing company or the shipper themselves. But tank cars are definitely not owned by the railroads. They're very expensive to purchase. They're even more expensive to maintain. And it takes a lot of work. I mean, most companies that have a sizable fleet of cars that they own have a management, either a management company or a whole separate department that manages those rail cars for them, because there's a lot involved. It's not as straightforward as you might think. So keeping up with it can be a lot, and railroads just don't want to take on that cost or liability.
Yep. And cost liability, one of those things. Yeah, if you can have a flatbed car and your maintenance is minimal, and there aren't that many things that can go wrong with it, that's where the railroad's going to choose to spend their money to be able to purchase more.
Well, and the other thing too about those other types of cars is a lot of them are not in captive service. So the car may haul one thing today and something else tomorrow, depending on who gets the car that day. And you pay for the use of that car, and then that's it. When it comes to tank cars, they tend to be in dedicated service. They are generally carrying one product for, if not their whole life, for at least the length of the lease. And most of the time, they're going to go back and forth between one customer and one supplier. They don't generally, go here today and there tomorrow, like those other cars do. And so because of that, the railroads get a lot of use out of those, flat cars and so forth, but they wouldn't get that same utilization out of a tank car because it's generally in dedicated service.
Understood. Well, I was thinking, for trucks as well, and so the tanker trucks, and the assumption is that a lot of those are in dedicated service as well, and so just something to be aware of for someone if you, and sorry, I keep bringing kind of the brokerage mentality of this, but understanding compatibility. So you may have this carrier that said, oh, I have a tank truck that I can go and pick up this product, to make sure that the product that you are putting in there is compatible with that trailer, that tank car, whether it's material, whether it's lined, whether it's not lined. These are some things to make sure that you truly understand what product you're shipping and how it can potentially react with that. Because the last thing you want to do is to send an aluminum trailer to go in that something where it's corrosive to aluminum. Bad things are going to happen there. So hopefully the carrier understands what they can move and what they can't move, and the shipper as well. But sometimes, again, one mistake or one absence of a little bit of information can cause a really big problem.
Yeah, and that all goes not only with the metal and the lining, like you mentioned, Andrew, but also with the gaskets and O-rings that are in the vehicle. It was kind of discovered quite by accident that ethanol does not play well with certain gasket types, and you would roll over a tank truck or a tank car, and everything would be fine. The car would hold the product just like it's supposed to, even though it rolled over. But then about an hour into the incident, all of a sudden that car is leaking, and it's like, wait a minute, why? All of a sudden. Well, what it would turn out is that the ethanol had eaten through the gaskets because it was not compatible. So, yes, from a reactivity standpoint with metals, definitely with linings for sure. Everyone thinks, oh, it's lined, it'll be able to protect the product. No, not all linings are compatible with all materials. So, yeah, keeping those things in mind and not sending, to your point, an aluminum tank truck to a sodium hydroxide load where that car is going to explode. So keeping that in mind. And, and that's the other thing too with trucks, because they are sometimes in dedicated service, but often not in dedicated service, you end up having to wash that tank truck out between every load. And it surprised me to realize not everyone understood that rail cars don't get washed out. Generally, the only time they ever get washed out is if they have to go to the shop. And that's because the shop doesn't want to deal with flammable residues and poisonous fumes and all of that sort of stuff. So it has to get washed before they're going to work on it most of the time.
What really?
Yeah, believe it or not. But when you're in tank truck service, you tend to get that tank truck washed out between every single load. There are exceptions, like you said, if it's in dedicated service, but most of the time it's going to go to this carrier today or this shipper today, that shipper tomorrow. So that's another difference between the two that people aren't really aware of.
Absolutely. And another thing that comes up is kind of the residue on that. For rail is that even though something may be emptied, if that rail is, on a, common rail line, it's still sort of in transportation and still subject to regulations, even though it's completely empty because there's residue in there.
Yes.
And so, trucks in a very similar way, that needs to get cleaned, or like I said, if it's in dedicated service, but they can still be hazardous, whether it's fumes, whether it's gases that build up on that, or the residue itself is hazardous, whether it's flammable or corrosive or any of the other potential hazards, poison inhalation hazards, whatever it may be. Again, awareness of that.
Before we end the conversation today, let's switch over for a second and talk about some of those smaller package shipments, right? So we were talking about containers, and we were talking about trailers and things like that, and boxes and drums and pallets. One of the things to keep in mind is if you're going to send stuff on a truck, by its very nature of the way that the transportation works, you're going to experience certain things, right? You're going to have vibrations, you're going to have bumps, you're going to have a lot of side-to-side motion as the truck is going around corners and turns and things. But when it comes to rail, you don't have so much of the bumps and things because it's a steel track. I mean, it's not generally too bumpy. It's pretty smooth most of the time. And most of the forces that you're going to have experience are going to be front and back forces, those lateral forces, because, the car's going to, as the train stops, it's going to push in the slack. And as it starts to move, it'll take that slack out. So you get a lot of that forward and backward motion. You get different types of vibrations than you would get on a truck and things like that. So one of the things to keep in mind is I've seen a rash recently of, blocking and bracing is really important, right? Blocking is protecting that load against lateral forces, side to side, front to back, whereas bracing is going to be bracing it from vertical motion. So you're going to be preventing it from bouncing in the truck, which, you wouldn't think it's going to bounce all that much. It's just going down the highway, but you'd be surprised. It hits a pothole, it goes over a speed bump, or hits a little bit of debris in the road too quickly. You get a lot more of those bumps and stuff, and certain highways that don't seem to ever be maintained properly.
Or plus there in terms of transportation infrastructure and things like that.
Yeah, orange barrel season, as we like to call it here in the Midwest. So anyway, the point is blocking and bracing is supposed to work in tandem, but you have to keep in mind the different types of forces you're undergoing. If you're just going by truck, if you're just going by rail, and if you're going by intermodal, it's going to undergo both of those things, because part of the transportation will be by truck and part by rail, and potentially even part by vessel, which is yet another whole set of forces that has a lot of yaw forces to it, because it's rocking and rolling and moving in different directions than it would on highway or rail. So making sure that you have a very secure load, that you're taking up the gaps with either airbags or honeycomb filler or drop down filler or all sorts of different options. If you have any questions about blocking and bracing, certainly reach out to us. We're happy to help you with that. But keeping in mind, you do need blocking and bracing that work in tandem, no matter what mode of transportation you're going to, and taking in mind the forces that your packages will undergo in that container or trailer when it's moving.
Absolutely. And it's just such a great point in regards to that. So again, as a shipper, when you're loading that, to be aware of this kind of things, how is this going to be, transported? Multimodal in regards to that, or, kind of a single modal, and make sure that you do that, as opposed to, hey, here's a pallet. And then even observing if the driver is doing that, if it's kind of the LTL, how are they doing that? Understand how your carriers do block and brace that, because the last thing, you don't want to have an incident because they're like, oh, you've only got one pallet in there, and so we've got all this other stuff. But how is it, is it properly segregated as necessary? Is there multiple hazardous materials within that truck from different shippers? Understand the carriers that you're using and how they manage that as well. So that becomes part of the, that validation process and verification.
That's a great point, Andrew. And I didn't even think to mention that, but you're absolutely right. Segregation and separation is huge. All 4 sections of the carrier regulations in the Hazmat set of regulations, 174 through 177, each of those has a segregation and separation table for each mode of transportation. Make sure you check those. And hint, those are actually really helpful for storing hazmat in warehouses too. Some materials just don't play nice together, but keep in mind not everything is in there. So, it considers corrosives all as one thing, but anyone who has a little bit of science background will know that acids and bases don't always play nice together, or acids and alkalis. So even though that table says that, you can put all the corrosives together and they'll play nice, it's not always true. So having that little extra bit of product knowledge and making sure your carriers are informed, especially if it's LTL carriers, can be very, very helpful, because 2 things leak in the truck due to an accident or just happenstance, and you have a reaction back to the truck, bad things happen. There's a shell of a truck just up the street from my house that clearly caught fire, and all that's left is literally the skeleton of the trailer. You can see through the entire thing, and all that's left is the burned skeleton, and it's really cool pictures. Of course, I couldn't help myself. I got a bunch of them.
So you can be hazmat nerd going in there, so that works out.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that brings us again to the commercial side of the podcast on that. Really, as we're talking about this, any questions that you have, we have the Hazmat help desk to be able to do that if it's one-off type questions. But a lot of this comes down to understanding and training. And so again, we provide, a number of ways to get that training, whether it's live in-person training, virtual training. With the live, we also do, very much hands-on, very specific to the job function of what you're doing. But then we also offer online training as well, where Wendy's really sort of diving into that. And it's her presenting this. It's not just PowerPoints, and it's not just, generic kinds of thing. It's very specific to the modality, and it's very specific to the job function of what's going on. So please, if you get an opportunity, if you want to learn more about not only training, but understanding hazardous materials, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. As you can see, scrolling down on the bottom, we've got phone numbers there, website, of course, starshazmat.com, to be able to reach out, and we'd love to be able to help you and keep you and your team safe.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Andrew. I've enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you bringing up so many great topics. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for keeping us well informed and understanding and moving forward. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to talking to you in the next episode.
All right. Sounds great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining the Hazmatters podcast, brought to you by Stars Hazmat Consulting. To learn more about how Stars can help you for training and compliance, by building processes and programs, for fines and penalty mitigation, for questions about hazmat responsibilities and the regulations that govern our industry, visit our website at starshazmat.com or give us a call at 267-324-4002.